up to 3 questions together. Your question might be directed to one person or 2 persons or all of us, that's fine. If you want to identify yourself, please do it. If you don't want to identify yourself, that's also fine. It's your choice. So please ask a question, and then we'll come back to the panel together.
So my question is, so as a Tibetan, I wholeheartedly believe His Holiness is the only authority in deciding about his reincarnation. And as a human being, I feel we all have the fundamental human right of freedom of religion, and that no state or government, including the Chinese Communist Party, can interfere in religious matters. So for me, this is a clear-cut stance as a human. So my question to you panelists is, why do you think there is such a reluctance from governments, from actually also religious leaders? As we all know, His Holiness is a champion of interfaith, yet there has been such a silence or lack of acknowledgement about what is happening and how severe the situation is. So I wanted to ask yourselves why you think that could happen to someone who is so well respected globally, like His Holiness the Great 14th Dalai Lama. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very important question. Tenzin?
Thank you to all the speakers for their great presentations. My question is more about, when we talk to politicians and parliamentarians on the matter of reincarnation, it's a purely Buddhist religious tradition. And, my question is more about how can we narrate or explain this in a language it's easily accessible to everyone. Thank you so much.
Sure, why not? Okay. All right. I'm going to start with the second question, if that's okay. How can we explain the situation regarding the Dalai Lama's reincarnation and the questions surrounding it, and the questions surrounding incarnate lineage as a whole to a larger audience? Well, individually you can't. I'll be blunt about that. The truth of the matter is that, in order to explain an institution of this depth, you actually need to populate the discourse. And that is more than one person's job, it's lots of people's jobs. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we actually have these seminars, is because you actually need to build up understanding in the public domain of the institution as a whole, of the significance of the questions and things on those lines. And there has been a decline in that in the last 30 to 40 years, but it is also a very complex tradition. And so it's not something you can do individually. It's something that Tibetans, and I'll say this, do need to be a little bit more forthright in explaining the Tibetan view of the question. They tend to be a little quiet on this, and they let people, idiots like me, do that instead. And I don't feel up to the task, but I'll do it. But it would be better if lots more people were doing it. So let's start there. Second one is, why is there such a reluctance to acknowledge the situation regarding the Dalai Lama? There always has been. I mean, if we exclude the 80s and the 90s, from about that period onwards, lots of people love to have a photograph taken next to the Dalai Lama so they can put it in their biography. But in terms of doing things that are functional, that actually have an impact in the face of the People's Republic of China, pragmatic action is always very rare. Symbolic action is more popular on a personal level for most politicians, and that has always been a problem.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for both of those questions. I'll start with the first. So, why are governments not supporting, right, the Tibetan cause? So I'm American. I'm from the USA. That's where I was born. I'm a U.S. citizen. And the U.S. government does some things to support Tibet, but it does not do enough, by any stretch of the imagination, and that is because the power of China. Just going back, looking over history, right, giving China most favored nation trading status, all of the different, I feel like the United States has bent over backwards numerous times to try and accommodate China. Every time gets played, gets gamed by them, but just keeps going back for more. Governments fear China. They fear the size of China. They fear China's power. They don't understand communism. They don't understand decision-making within China, and they feel that China could make decisions and take actions that they're not anticipating. For such a large, powerful country, China remains a wild card to many governments, including my own. And that's, horrible. Presidents I've voted for, are ones who have given China things like most favored nation trading status in my country. So all of the appeasing of China that happens is because of fear, right? I think there is a real fear of China among many democracies, which are the bulk of world governments, especially following 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union. And in that case, when China stepped into that, the vacuum that was left with the fall of the Soviet Union, then China's power on the global scale in terms of, we'll say, the enemy, right, of the free world, right? It's China. In the United States, we have Cuba, kind of, down a little from Florida, but Cuba's, like the size of my fist. China's, the footprint of the entire UK, in comparison. So why are governments not supporting Tibet? They're scared of China, right? And they don't have the backbone, the moral spine. I think many of them do want to support Tibet, but they don't. If we go all the way back to the early 60s, right, after 1959, and who are the governments that stood up in the United Nations on behalf of Tibet? It's El Salvador, I think the Philippines, Ireland, it's like global powerhouses, all of them, right? I mean, lovely countries, but not countries that are going to diplomatically or militarily take on China, right? Of course, they had the US and probably the UK backing them, but there is a real fear of China that still persists, and I wish it wasn't so. There are good people in governments around the world trying to do the work, including my own, including here in the UK, but it's in the second tiers, or it's in, those tiers. The second question, how to... Reincarnation is hard to understand. Right? I'm guessing if you are in this room, you are someone who understands it, even if you're not Tibetan, right? It makes sense to you. Outside of the Buddhist world, it's a little hard for people who have never encountered Buddhism to really understand what reincarnation is, to understand that the Dalai Lama is an unbroken lineage that dates back, centuries, that the Dalai Lama is both a political and a religious leader, and also is more than that, is not just either of those, right? Is someone in who you, going back to my prayer, in who you, like Dipa, right? In who you place your faith, right? In whom you dedicate things to beyond just someone I voted for. Or to whom I go to, the equivalent in the UK and the US would be like, the pastor or priest, or, at your church, perhaps, who you maybe go see once a week, but maybe that was what your grandparents did, and you now only go once a year at Christmas. There's no equivalent. I wish there was a way. How do we... I don't know if it was easier when the Dalai Lama was both a political leader and a religious leader for the world. When he was a political leader, he would go in the White House, say, through the back door. As a religious leader, he could now potentially go in through the front door. But he doesn't, because he hasn't been invited, right? And that's the power of China. Explaining a religious and a political leader who is more than both, right? Who is also a reincarnation, and so is both human and not, is not something easy to do, but it's something really important to do. And it's something, I think, going back to Tibetan, that like those of us, Tibetan and not, who are scholars, are trying to do that. And for the Tibetan community to also be involved in that, regardless of what your occupation or status is, really, truly matters. Right, that your voices are part of that conversation about who you are and what your traditions are. and how your traditions continue and matter right now in the 21st century, right? That they're not just something of the past.
I think actually both the questions are well explained, but I need to meet a little bit for the second question. I've always feel like is when you explain sort of, for example, reincarnations, it's really always important to know to whom you are going to explain that kind of person. Or a case of lobbies, we're doing lots of lobbies both in state, European countries. That's why I think I remember one of the former Tibetan Prime Minister Sikyong Lobsang Sankey's statements in that regard. If you do lobby in the state, you always said, oh, we need a freedom of religion. You have a connection with Dalai Lama. We need a freedom of religion, very powerful. If you do similar things in this country, especially European countries who are very much have a church state issue historically embedded in people's mind, you said, okay, well, legally, we need a freedom of, as an individual, secular right, legal right. Those are more powerful, more effective. So it's really always depend on the individual. So suppose another issue is among Tibetans, we always assume other people are similar to us. His Holiness is really important to us. We have so much belief into that. But sometimes it's really important to take yourself out of the box, to put yourself out of people's place, then you explain from a different angle. That's also very important. As many of those scholars mentioned, as an individual, this is a self-determination of His Holiness as an individual. Forget about his religious kind of importance. As an individual, he definitely has a right to choose what he wanted to be the next. So those are, I think, sometimes more important or more effective.
Thank you, and I'll not repeat any of it, but in this case, again, the audience matters. So any kind of advocacy is to be done. What advocacy usually should avoid is saying it's very complex. Or it's very complex, but for you, we can tell you how it works. But also in case of advocacy, you appeal to the self-interest of whoever you're addressing. Because majority, even when they claim to be driven by moral and other things, they're driven by other aspects, right? And this is where China's power comes in, right? Now, your question in terms of, you also ask, why do other religious leaders not say, at least on this thing, they may not talk of Tibetan independence or self-determination, but why not at least this matter? And I would say, in one sense, is Dalai Lama is not that well known. When I say that well, okay, people know, yes, Dalai Lama. I ask a lot of people, oh yeah, I've heard the Dalai Lama, that's it. So what I'm saying is, we have to go beyond, I'm not saying there's a bubble, but we have to go beyond ourselves to realize that for majority of people with all kinds of wars taking place, all kinds of conflicts taking place, all kinds of tensions taking place, they have heard of him, they know of him vaguely, but not beyond that. So how do we then make more people aware? He has been amazing. He has worked with every single religion and non-religion to advocate them, to support them. But think of how many of other religious leaders have actually spoken and tried to take risks by going with him. Very few. So that's an important part to bear in mind, that it has often been one way, in my view. And of course, the practical reality is Vatican. Why does Vatican not say much on his institution? They could have, but of course, because they want some kind of reconciliation with the Chinese government, that's always the case. Why have most Buddhist leaders in the world not said anything on the Dalai Lama? That's again to do with China and, of course, division within Buddhism. So we have to bear those things in mind. But where the hope comes from, of course, is even when they've heard of Dalai Lama, they respect the Dalai Lama, is what can we all do to remind that he matters because he matters to you. Because if someone doesn't believe in him, doesn't believe in Buddhism, then fine, it is your religion, what can I do? So appeal about, it's about individual interest. It's about our rights. It's about human rights. It's about right to religion. It's about freedom of religion. It is about geopolitics. It's about this is happening to us, but look, it's happening to Uyghurs now. It can happen to you also in the future. So depending on the context, do that. But I said, there's reluctance, and that has to be challenged. But again, I started more than 2 decades ago with Tibet-related research. In my view, of course, the interest in Tibet has declined significantly. I can count, and I'm sure we can count amongst even the Tibet-related scholars, both Tibetans and non-Tibetans. I can count how many of us do talk of contemporary politics, Tibet rights. Very few. Majority, even Tibet scholars, maintain silence on it. They might respect the Dalai Lama, they might respect Tibetan culture, but the moment it comes to talking about human rights, Tibet, reincarnation not being politicized by Chinese government, or saying anything that might be seen as politically sensitive, which for China is everything practically, by the way, you'll find a lot of silence. So we have to push back against it. Anyway, next round, please.
The topic of this new current sort of Chinese legislation, I assume it's in play. I haven't read too much about it, but I assume they're currently enforcing that, let's say, quote unquote, in the Tibetan regions. They don't certainly do that in India. So I guess my mind was towards what do you think what does the panel think will be the likely chain of events when the Dalai Lama does unfortunately at some point pass away? What are the likely chain of events, in particular looking at the Chinese set of actions and then I guess more widely, what does that mean for the Tibetan community in exile? And in contextualizing that a little bit, in that the way I see it, this legislation is really a generic one looking at reincarnations generally. And I think if I read correctly, there's some sort of an approval dynamic built in there so that if you are looking to recognize a reincarnation, you have to seek a permit of some sort. So since this was sort of 2007 or something, has that historically happened to date from that point of view, from that point onwards in Tibet? And then what levers do Tibetans have, I guess, in that unfortunate circumstance when the Dalai Lama does pass away?
Hi, my name is Charles Manson. Thank you very much to all four and to the organizer as well. Well done. I've written a book about the origins of this system from the point of view of Karmapakshi, going from his memoirs, really. And I didn't deal with the political, because it wasn't political at that time. But I would like to ask, and we've sort of beginning to touch on it a little bit with how do you address this to people, and also the previous question. What do you think should be, or what's your opinion on what the strategy should be on this? Because in a sense, Tibet and Tibetans have to prepare now. I mean, perhaps they have been preparing. I don't say that they haven't. But to a certain degree, it hasn't been working, I think. China just plows on. And there are other examples elsewhere. Perhaps Mandela might be an interesting example of how people actually strategize in order that when he does, unfortunately, pass away, that people are ready, or we can see in 5-10 years afterwards that it was the right thing to do now for when that happens. And what would be your opinions on that kind of strategy?
Thank you very much. A very important question about, and especially the second part is about the strategy. So yes, so we have discussed what ought to happen, but what is the strategy, given that how can Tibetan community and those who support Tibetan community prepare for what needs to be done strategy-wise? Second, there was a third, and then fourth later.
Hi, thanks everyone. My question ties quite closely to the first, but I'll say it anyway, and I'll follow up with another one. So my question was just like from my understanding, there's like a strong likelihood that the PRC will or the CCP will suggest a candidate. It's like maybe out of the question that His Holiness has a full and like separate reincarnation process. So perhaps like the options I see are perhaps like 2 Dalai Lamas existing, or none being chosen by His Holiness or his institution, and there being one being presented in China. So I wonder if that like understanding is slightly different to yours, and if so, how? And the question I wanted to ask, since like it's quite similar to the first, I was hearing from some friends last year that there was quite a lot of rumors speculating within Tibet that His Holiness might be able to return for a visit, and ultimately that didn't happen. And the reasons for it not happening, I mean, it's all speculative, but at least I know that among my friends there were quite a lot of like internal migration from areas that His Holiness would definitely not be able to visit towards more central or populated areas. So there's a lot of hope, and there's still time, of course, for that to happen, and perhaps the panel might be able to speak on, if they would be able to envision that.
My name is Chini. I don't have a specific question today, but I just want to take the time to thank you, all panelists, for taking your time on a Friday night to educate us, and because I think it's truly important that me just being a Tibetan is not enough, and I need to educate myself. And you guys here, all professors, taking your time to educate us is very touching for me. And seeing the amount of respect and seeing the amount of passion that you have put and dedicated your lives into studying about the Tibetan cause has really touched me, and I want to thank you all for today.
Thank you. I should have asked you to do the final conclusion. That would be such a touching word, but thank you so much. So there are questions around likelihood of what will happen. Second is about what strategies can be adopted to prepare for that. Third is about how is it actually being implemented, permitted, etc. Fourth is reference specifically to, I would say, I put the word millenarian hope, but speculation, hope, whether he could return or not, kind of thing. So both are related to the likelihood and the strategy and the practice. So Martin, I'll go to you first again, because you never know when you'll disappear with the online connection. So please go ahead first.
Okay, all right, I'm going to first three questions and try and answer them all together. Little biography here. Nearly 40 years ago, as a young man just returning from 6 months in Tibet in 1987, I had the good fortune, because I went to St Andrews University, to have lunch with Hugh Richardson a few years before he died. And we discussed this matter, and I will say what he said, which is still, unfortunately, seems to be true. The world will not save Tibet. He was always really, really angry about that. He said, the world will not save Tibet, Tibetans have to save Tibet. And that's a really important point in terms of just, one can't keep just going to the world and saying, look, terrible things are happening, you need to sort it out. The world kind of needs a horse to ride on. And that horse does need to come back to that question of a strategy that looks like it might win. Now, as far as that's concerned, there are issues, and they come back. If you'll excuse me momentarily, taking off my politics and legal hat and putting on my head of religious studies for 10 years hat, which is traditionally one of the things that the Tibetan community does, as I said, is from a bottom-up perspective, when a Dalai Lama returns, is offer back to him all the things that belong to him, all the lineages, all the property, all of those things. So here's the question. What will the Tibetan community within and outside Tibet have to offer to a future returning Dalai Lama? How much of the tradition, how much of the lineage, how much of the possessions, how much of those things will be there to offer back? Will it just be some nice prayers, a couple of Khataks, and a few aprons? So there's your question, and that's a lifetime-long question, because it may be 30 years going into the future. There are things that can be done at this point in time. Those are concrete things. For example, in the exile community, there are constitutional problems at the heart of the charter that need resolution because they were sorted out initially after His Holiness retired from political office, but they have left a variety of issues untidied up. And that's not a complaint about the reform committee. That's natural when you're making a really big shift, that there is stuff that is undone. But they are significant issues which are standing in the way of political agency. And so some kind of constitutional review, that would be good. In order to move forward, I think a larger vision going forward for 100 years does need to be put into place and needs to be thought of. What that looks like, well, that's not my decision.
Thank you, Martin.
I can go next. These are all the main questions, right? Like these are the questions before anyone who is Tibetan or anyone like myself who has committed themselves, right, in some ways to Tibet and the Tibetan cause. It is impossible to know. So let's talk about what we do know, which is that it seems pretty clear that the Chinese government is going to find and declare someone to be the next Dalai Lama. His Holiness has the indications that he's given is that he is also going to reincarnate again, and that will be for the Tibetan community to find through those traditional means. So it might very well be the case, as with the Panchen Lama, that there are two Dalai Lamas. It will be very evident to the Tibetan community, inside and outside Tibet, which is the real Dalai Lama. Tibetans inside Tibet will have to perform certain signs of respect to any Dalai Lama who's named by the Chinese government. And the world is going to be a little confused. We will also have the question of what in English is known as the interregnum, right? When the Dalai Lama is a minor, right? And is a boy, is a child, right? And the 14th Dalai Lama had to become, take his full powers at a young age. Was he 16, correct? 16 years old. I am a mother. I can tell you my kids at 16 were absolutely not ready to be leaders of their country, right? And yet, of course, he was, right? He had the training, he had the support, he had the constitution, because he was the Dalai Lama. And yet this next Dalai Lama is going to be in an entirely new world, where also now, I mean, let's be honest, there have been multiple times in the history of Tibet where two reincarnations have been found of the same office, lineage holder, I believe even Dalai Lama, looking around the room for confirmation of that, right? I mean, so this gravity, not with the other, not when it was just, like infighting or bickering between two, aristocratic families. Instead now, this is two governments, and two governments that are asymmetrical. One has massive power, and one is in exile, right? And one are a people who remain colonized. So while His Holiness, is the one who will make decisions, assemble, the search teams perhaps will be assembled in traditional historic ways, there's also, I presume, because I am not privy to all of this, but work taking place behind the scenes, right, to prepare world governments to know what might happen. Tibetan, offices around the world and your allies, right? Those of you in the room who are Tibetan, people like myself and Dipesh and Martin, right, and our friends in the different activist groups around the world, right, making sure that the information that governments need to understand the legitimate reincarnation, that they have that information before them. But I think this is going to be difficult. And I think that's one reason why it's important, right, for scholars to come together, and especially those of you who are Tibetans, to call on your scholars. Right? Help us with the empirical data we need, right? With the history, with the political facts, right? For the arguments that we know, right, from community, from history, from family, let's pair that with the scholarship, right, and work together.
I'll start with the question of Namgyal. I think from my understanding, I think it's very highly unlikely that he could be able to visit back in Tibet. So any coming circumstance. So if that's connect with the first question, if he could not return back to his homeland and suppose unfortunately pass away, then there is a very possible scenario that there could be two Dalai Lamas, one is born in Tibet, one is born in exile wherever in other countries. So, but how does it could be? Because that's pretty clear now. We have very different instructions. If you look at His Holiness official instruction of his next reincarnation issued by 2011, that he said he is going to born in a free country to continue his works that he haven't finished in his lifetime. So, as my colleague mentioned that last September in 2024 in Lanzhou, in one of Chinese cities, they have a national level scholarly organization organized by Chinese Communist Party. They declared by official policy about reincarnation. They said the next Dalai Lama should born inside China, should be approved by the Communist Party, should be used by the Golden Inn. That's the three conditions. So if you look at these two statements, there is no common ground. There's no common ground. So that is possible. That's why we need to have a two reincarnation. That's very, very possibilities there. But however, we really don't need to be very scared about that. Because we have one example, the Panchen Lama. They already did that, wasn't successful. After 30 years, no one believed in Panchen Lama, the one recognized by China. Even the other one in jail. But if Dalai Lama's case, if he was born in a free country, he's free to travel, free to give his lecture speeches, then that cannot be impossibly challenged by the Communist Party, no matter how much money they invest in that particular person, whoever he is. Then, but another scenario, I want to end this with a short story, because I met a student from Tibet a couple of years back. Then we watched Panchen Lama's case. Then in middle of after some couple of friends together, middle of the video, she started crying. She's from Jikase, close somewhere Jikase area. She's crying. Then I asked her, what happened? Because for many years, her mom, her grandma, never know that the Panchen Lama recognized by China is the fake one. Because that's the control of information. That could be happened the next Dalai Lama as well. Some people in the countryside, they don't know. We have another Dalai Lama in exile because they have a total control of information in China now. That's scenario happened individual level, but in large scale, I don't think they can compare any other ways than someone we found in exile in a free country.
Thank you. So in terms of the speculation part, the history tells us that in many societies where there's a lot of suppression and conflict and stress is the language I'm using deliberately widely, there's often that kind of speculation about something may happen, something positive may happen. So it's nothing new in that case in terms of the possibility of the return of the Dalai Lama. There have been history in various societies, that whole idea of someone coming, the person they have cherished for might come back. So that's how it is. But practically, unless there's still secret negotiation going on between the Dalai Lama's representative and Beijing, and somehow India is allowing it, which is unlikely, and somehow things like that, it's highly unlikely, right? I would say that's it. But partly you have to also respect and understand hope of Tibetans in Tibet that might actually happen. So that's what to understand. In terms of likelihood, as we have discussed, the possible likelihood, if Chinese government was seriously concerned about stability, I'm just focusing on stability. I think from Chinese government's perspective, forget about us, right? Chinese government. Dalai Lama offers stability. This Dalai Lama is the only one. I know many of you might believe in Rangzen, independence, be skeptical, but I do believe that he's the only one who can sell middle way to Tibetan people. He's the only one, possibly. Now, if he can't, there's no way in which any future Dalai Lama, any future leader of Tibet in exile can sell any of that. Because how can any leader, imagine, I'm sorry, but someone is a leader in the future, say to you that, you know what, yes, it didn't work out when 14 Dalai Lama was there, but somehow my compromise will work. It won't work out. So from Chinese government's perspective, here's an opportunity still. But the second opportunity for them could be, and this is speculation again, of course, we have to speculate in international, we do that a lot, is in terms of where they may not choose anyone, but they might withhold recognition of the one in exile and use that as a bargaining chip, which is what governments do, to say, well, we might recognize a boy or girl or the person in exile in return for certain compromises. So I know it sounds very impossible, but in history again and in world politics, these kind of compromises take place. But the moment the likelihood of true reincarnation, there is the end of any possibility of compromise between Tibet and China. So the only way it can be still that if there's at least one. That's one. In terms of the strategy part, my view would be that reducing dependence on the Dalai Lama for Tibetan movement. The Tibetan movement is heavily dependent on him for all the reasons we have identified, but that dependence is also it's the biggest strength, but it's also the biggest weakness. Because whoever in 40, 50 years' time would be the 15th Dalai Lama, young, growing up, etc., it's highly unlikely that they would have the charisma or the time or and other things where they can bring people together. So I'm just saying is one way for Tibetan movement of self-determination to continue to survive and flourish, and I'm focusing on flourishes, to reduce the dependence on the Dalai Lama, which is what the Dalai Lama has been wanting. So by stepping down from the political position, he has given a very clear message to, I'm saying to you Tibetans, because I'm not a Tibetan, to you that please stop depending on us, me. You find your own future. So he has been, in one sense, democratizing Tibetan community in exile. He has been focusing on that you want self-determination, learn how to deal with self-determination. Don't depend on me. So I do think that that is a key thing, a strategy that all can help with this, reducing dependence on the Dalai Lama for the Tibetan movement. I did want to highlight something before I pass it on to Druktalk. Some of you may have seen, most of you would not have seen. I'm not that much on Facebook these days, but I read it. So when this event was announced, and Tibetan Studies SOAS announced it, there was a comment made. One woman, that's you, one woman and others who have shown a bias towards the Gelugpa mainstream narrative in Tibet and China, ? I hope there will be some discussion of the Mongolian Gelug shadow over Tibet since the time of the 5th Dalai Lama without sugarcoating it to appease the ongoing Gelug sectarian political dominance in exile. Highly sectarian comment made by someone. So all of us somehow, and which means you also, by the way, all of us are part of this conspiracy of Gelug supremacy and Gelug dominance. So I read the article they shared. That article, and they ignore the fact that Karmapa, exile, has made it very clear that the issue of the Dalai Lama is for Dalai Lama to recognize, right? But they have ignored it, but they're playing a sectarian game. Who the person is, I don't know, but clearly there are people that I know. That's all. Going back. So something else I would suggest for Tibetan movement and for those of us interested in Tibet is to avoid the, I know it's sometimes unavoidable, but avoid the poison of very calculated divisiveness, including sectarianism of what is pure, what's not pure. These things keep coming. I know we get it, but that's there. So but I have to end in positive note. Positive note was not the sectarian comment, but your note again. Please don't thank us. And when I say us, I'm not including you, by the way, but I'm including Martin, Carol, and myself. Remember, you, in one sense, by letting us work with you, so none of us ever, and I know us, at least I don't know of others, but none of that, we never claim to speak for Tibetans. We are often with Tibetans, and where we use our own positions and institutional whatever we have to make sure that your voices are. So we are very much into the co-production of knowledge with you rather than speaking for you. So you don't need to thank us. It's a mutual gratitude that we should be doing. On that note, let me pass it back to Druktalk, and thank you for organizing Druktalk.
Okay, thank you everyone. So we have 15 minutes left. Please let me allow to take 5 minutes. So this panel discussion is hosted by LSE Anthropology Department. So I really want to thank the department to host and also announce to the department's students and staff. Druktalk podcast discussions on Tibet, China, and international relations, and also Tibetan history, politics, all these things. So you can find few of episodes in English, but most of them are in Tibetan.
Thank you, Dr. So I'm Taran Hamo. I'm the current coordinator of Volunteer Tibet Advocacy Group UK. So it's a group of Tibetans who are spending their time to advocate for a cause that is central to all Tibetans. Now, Dr. mentioned the workshop. So how it all started was we were very lucky to attend a workshop by International Tibet Network on Tibet, the Dalai Lama and Politics of Reincarnation. And this is after they've done the report. I've kept some copies if anyone wants to have a look through. At that workshop, the ones who got to attend, then we came back and said, we're going to hold a workshop for Tibetans and our other volunteer members so we can all learn more about the topic. And one of the things that came up when we were having this workshop was we need to have factual information like in the report, but we also need to have the information from our experts. And that's why we are so grateful to all of you, and we are thankful because most of us do not come from a scholarly background or from academics or from anything related to political or religious or any of these topics, really. So for us, this is a completely different walk of life, and we do need our experts, we do need our scholars, so we've got all the right facts. So when we do go to our MPs and we advocate for Tibet, and when we advocate for our religious freedoms, that we've got all the information to share with them, and if we need to then direct them to further sources, we need to get to know you guys as well. So I thought this was really good opportunity, and I'm really grateful to Druktalk because he's managed to get all of you here. And it's a difficult task, and to be honest, he's mainly done this himself. So I do have immense gratitude to our panelists and Druktalk, and for that I would request His Eminence Asanga Wajarumbuche to please offer a white scarf or kata. So Professor Martin Mills, you are virtual, but for everyone, all the other panelists, please may I request that. You as well.
Namgila is like LSE Tibetan society, and we have Prince Sangla is also here. And we have Vinala here. Yeah. And we have Tara here. Yeah, that's all. Thank you so much, everyone joining in here. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Oh, thank you, Martin.